I was curious what the biggest feature or change is that you'd like to see go into the kernel, but you don't think is very likely or plausible to happen, either because it's fundamental architectural change or just not something we can get to from an incremental series of patches?
Well, obviously Linus wants to see Xan.
I really don't have personally anything like that. One of the things I worried about early on in the 2.6 series was when we got over the whole big jump between 2.4 and 2.5, having a stable tree versus having this crazy development tree where anything goes. One of the things I used to worry about was whether we could do certain things. And it's been 5 years or whatever now, and we've never hit a problem where we couldn't implement a thing because we didn't have a development tree. I'm not seeing any feature that I am looking forward to and that would seem to be impossible to develop due to our model or due to how our kernel is organized. But as I mentioned earlier, as far as I'm concerned, the kernel has already done what I want to do for a long time. So other people may well disagree.
Okay, so I see everybody shaking their heads. So let's turn this question around. As you said, in the 2.6 development model, we started out with a model we didn't know how it would work very well, and we tried to merge features. And as you say, we've learned a lot over the 6 years we've been executing this model. What was the biggest problem that we encountered trying to execute the new model, and what did we learn from it that we would no longer do today?
Anybody else?
Oh, you don't want to answer this. Okay, Greg.
That we would no longer do today?
Well, what have we learned in those 6 years something we did wrong initially that we now know how to get right? What is the summary of our learning over these 6 years of executing this 3-month stabilization?
We've learned how to work with each other better so that if I break Chris's tree, I will be notified and yelled at, and I'll fix it, which is a big deal because we end up touching different parts of the kernel API changes, so we know now how to work better together. We got the Linux Next tree going,
right.
Building every night, merging, telling us. We have people telling us build problems. We have a much better infrastructure in order to handle the ability for us to work together easier. And that's taken us some learning process to get it to make Linus happier.
Yes. I think actually, if I would phrase it, the biggest thing we learned is the 2-week merge window. That seems to be about the engine which drives sort of this stabilization development model that we're doing. But anybody else care to add anything? I think John was nodding sagely.
Well, I was going to mention the merge window because when we first sort of formalized the new development model, there was no merge window, and stability of some of those releases was not as good as it could have been. So what we've learned is some discipline. It took us a while to really figure out how to apply the right kind of discipline and the right kind of rules to come up with stable releases at the end of each development cycle.
Yeah. So if you remember the old ISO 9001 process, we're actually following it. You don't care how bad the rules are, as long as we follow them, that's it, we're golden.
So one interesting thing that happened last week was I actually managed to meet with the NTFS architect at Microsoft, and we were actually comparing notes about how the Windows Core OS team does thing and the Linux development model. And the interesting thing is that Redmond has independently come up with something almost identical to what we're doing. They actually have a quarterly release cycle which roughly maps to what we have, and they do have a merge and then stabilization period. He claims they didn't actually copy us, and we actually theorized
it's okay, we believe
that it probably is a case of when you're doing development at this scale, it's one of the few things that actually works well.
Yeah. So there's your headlines, press people. Microsoft validates Linux development model. So I think I saw a question over here.
Seeing how human beings always seem so good at not learning from history and therefore repeating it, the processes that you've just been talking about, have you been able to document that, or are you figuring out how to document that so that those lessons don't have to be relearned by the next generation that comes along? Or is the ISO 9000 taking care of all those problems?
So I believe Linus just said to the, was it the score maintainer that the reading the mailing list was the documentation, right?
I don't think we have a lot of documentation. I mean, we have some. What I think is much more important is how actually the Linux way, the kernel way of doing things has clearly entered the hive mind when it comes to open source. A lot of other projects are starting to, or have long used, like similar, not just tools, but also release processes. I noticed that in the kernel we have this sign-off process where patches, as they flow through people, are supposed to be signed off. And we had legal reasons for doing it initially, and the legal reasons have kind of gone away because nobody worries about SEO very much anymore. But it turns out it's a really nice flow process where people actually see how code came in, so it's nice. And I'm seeing that in a number of non-kernel projects too. So I think there may not be a lot of documentation about how the kernel does it, but I think a lot of open source people do see the kernel model, and it actually ends up being this kind of, the same way there's this Unix mindset of how things are supposed to work. I think the kernel model has actually become this mindset of how open source projects are supposed to work, at least for a subset of projects out there.
So for every project manager, sorry.
I think they will just pick it up. It's more of a, it's not a law, it's not a document, it's more of a culture. And I think it's something that you learn the same way you learn a culture. You don't learn a culture by reading books, you kind of get it from just being involved. And I think that is happening. Because I know I've seen all these projects that I know I didn't talk to about the whole sign-off process thing.
So if you're a project manager out there, just remember, engineers naturally love process. Okay, John has a comment.
Yeah, I might add, there is documentation in the kernel. You can read documentation/how-to, which I think Greg did. So if you look under documentation/development process, there's some pretty thorough documentation of how the process works that I did with support from the Linux Foundation, actually. Supported that work. And there's also an awful lot of outreach that goes on. Greg and I were in Taipei earlier this year talking to hardware engineers there about how to work with the kernel process. So there's an ongoing effort out there. It's not just hoping people will come into the kernel mailing list and find it to be a naturally welcoming sort of place and just hang out and learn stuff, right? I mean, people are actually working towards this goal of bringing people in and helping them to work effectively with the processes that we have.
So as an illustration of LKML, how many people on this panel still actually read almost every message on it? Wow. So 2 out of 5 isn't bad?